Sister's wedding was just gorgeous, my mother said, setting the gravy boat down like she was placing a trophy on a shelf. The florals, the string quartet, Chloe looked like an absolute princess coming down that aisle. She turned to me, fork paused midair, wearing that particular smile she saved for public corrections, warm on the surface, precise underneath, like a blade wrapped in a napkin.
So,
when's yours? The table didn't even pause its chewing. My Aunt Ruth kept buttering her roll. My Uncle Tom kept scrolling something under the table, the blue glow reflecting off his glasses. This was routine. This was the joke that got told every single year, at every gathering, and I was always the punchline standing at the front of the room, expected to laugh along at my own expense because the alternative was being dramatic. Already had mine, I said. I kept my voice light, the way you'd mention you'd already seen a movie someone was recommending. 3 years ago. You got invitations. The room went quiet in a way I'd never heard it go quiet before. Not the polite lull between courses, not the customary hush before someone says grace. Dead silence, the kind where you can hear the refrigerator hum through the wall, where you can hear your own heartbeat in your ears. My father set his knife down against his plate with a small, deliberate click. We never received anything. I reached into the tote bag I'd brought and set beside my chair, the one I'd packed specifically for this evening, because some stubborn, tired part of me had known, walking in the door 2 hours earlier, that this would be the Thanksgiving where I finally said something. I pulled out a manila folder, slightly bent at one corner from the drive over. Inside were printed delivery confirmations from the wedding stationer, date stamped, address matched, each one showing a signature scrawled at the bottom in blue ink. All signed for, I said, sliding the papers across the table, past the cranberry sauce and the basket of dinner rolls no one had touched in the last 2 minutes. At this address. 3 years ago in October. My mother's face had gone the color of the tablecloth. Now, I said, and I made myself say it evenly, though my hands were not quite steady, I know exactly who threw them away. Backstory. To understand how we arrived at that folder, you have to understand what it meant to be the middle daughter in the Alvarez household, and you have to understand my mother because it would be too easy to flatten her into a villain, and I've spent years resisting that flattening, even when it would have been simpler. My name is Marisol, Mari, to anyone who mattered, and I was born between 2 siblings who never had to work particularly hard for anyone's attention. My older brother Diego was the family's first son, golden by simple accident of birth order and gender in a household that still, quietly, valued both. My younger sister Chloe was the baby, adored for existing, for being small and easy to dote on long after she'd stopped being small. I was the one in the middle, not neglected exactly, but perpetually compared, my report cards held up next to Diego's academic ease and found wanting, my quiet adolescent interests measured against whatever version of Chloe's eventual wedding day my mother had already been narrating to herself since Chloe turned 6. I want to be fair to my mother because understanding her doesn't mean excusing her, and I learned that distinction the hard way. She was a woman who had given up a nursing scholarship at 22 to marry my father, a decision she framed for 30 years as romantic and only once, drunk on my aunt's homemade sangria at a cousin's quinceanera, admitted she sometimes resented. She kept a house that never once had her name on the deed. She raised 3 children while working part-time at a dental office for 2 decades, never once complaining aloud, though the complaint lived in every sharp comment she made about other women's easier lives. Somewhere along the way, I think, she decided her own worth would come entirely from what her children achieved on her behalf, publicly, visibly, in a way the neighbors could witness. Chloe's wedding wasn't only Chloe's wedding. It was proof, printed in real time, that my mother had done something right with her life, that 30 years of unpaid domestic labor had produced something the world would recognize and admire. I understood that, in the abstract, distant way you understand things you haven't yet found a way to forgive. What I couldn't forgive, not then, not for years afterward, was the specific weapon she chose to use against me, which was my aloneness. Every single gathering, every single year, in front of whoever happened to be present, she'd ask when I was getting married, as though the absence of a ring on my finger were a moral failing correctable through sufficient effort, like a messy room or a missed appointment. Diego brought his fiancée Amanda home once and got a parade, a special dinner, my mother's good china toast. Chloe brought home 3 different boyfriends over the years, and each one got treated like visiting royalty. My mother pulling out old photo albums, asking about their families, their 5-year plans, their favorite holidays, building a whole future in real time, whether the relationship lasted 3 months or 3 years. I brought home one boy in college. His name was James. He loved dogs and read poetry unironically, and once drove 4 hours in a snowstorm to bring me soup when I had the flu. My mother spent the entire dinner asking him increasingly specific questions about his career trajectory, his retirement savings at 22 years old, whether his parents had assets. James was polite. James answered every question. James stopped calling me 2 weeks later, and when I asked him why, he said, gently, that he didn't think he could handle being interviewed every time he wanted to see me. After that, I stopped bringing anyone home. Not because I stopped meeting people, dating people, occasionally falling for people. I simply stopped trusting my family with anything that mattered to me because I had learned definitively at 19 years old that my family's love came with an audit attached. I left for graduate school in marine biology at 23, 600 miles north along the coast, and something in me exhaled fully for what felt like the first time in my adult life. Not because the work was easy. Coral and kelp ecosystem research rarely is, involving early mornings, cold water, tedious data entry that stretched long into the night, but because for the first time, nobody in the building was measuring me against my siblings. My advisor cared whether my sample collection was rigorous. My roommates cared whether I'd eaten dinner or was living on granola bars again. Nobody asked when I was getting married. Nobody cared about my ring finger. I had, for the first time, room to simply exist. Secret success building. I met Daniel during my 2nd year of the program at a research station perched above the Oregon coastline, both of us hip-deep in a tide pool at 6 in the morning trying to catalog the same population of ochre sea stars before the tide turned and buried our data window. He handed me his spare pair of gloves without being asked, without making a production of the kindness, which is a small thing except that it was the first time in years someone had given me something without expecting a performance of gratitude in return. We fell into an easy friendship over shared equipment and long silences that didn't need filling. We were friends for 8 months before either of us said anything real. Engaged 11 months after that, on a bluff overlooking the same tide pools at sunrise, no ring yet because we decided together to pick one out afterward, slowly, the way we did most things. I did not tell my family I was seeing anyone. I told them, vaguely, that I was busy with field work, which was entirely true and conveniently covered the larger, unspoken truth underneath it. I told myself I was protecting the relationship, keeping something whole and unexamined by people who had a particular talent for locating the fault line in anything good. I told myself this was strategy, not fear. It was fear. I had watched my mother dissect James over a single pasta dinner in under 20 minutes flat. I did not know and did not want to find out what she might do to something I actually intended to keep. Over the following 2 years, our life built itself quietly, brick by brick, in a state 600 miles from anyone who might have opinions about it. I finished my doctorate in coastal ecosystem restoration. Daniel finished his in marine biology the same spring, and we took jobs within driving distance of each other, mine with Noah, studying kelp forest degradation and restoration along the Pacific coast, occasionally testifying at state environmental hearings, his with a small nonprofit 2 towns over, running hands-on restoration dives with volunteer crews on weekends. We bought a small blue house on a hill with a partial view of the water, more mortgage than we could technically afford, and loved it with the specific ferocity of people who'd built something entirely by themselves. I had, by then, 2 close friends who functioned as the family I'd built by hand rather than the one I'd been born into. Priya, a fellow marine biologist I'd met in my program's first year, sharp-tongued and endlessly loyal, who once drove 3 hours in the middle of the night when I called crying after a bad diving accident scare, and Beck, a high school art teacher Daniel introduced me to, who baked absurdly elaborate cakes for every occasion, including several that weren't occasions at all. Neither of them ever once asked me when I was getting a real wedding because by the time they met me, I already had one. They'd been there. They knew Daniel. They knew the small ivory dress and the sunrise and the vows we'd written ourselves, one paragraph each, neither of us telling the other what we'd written until the ceremony itself. I called my mother maybe 4 times a year, birthdays, mostly, kept deliberately brief, structured like a business call. I never mentioned Daniel by name in those calls. When Rosa was born, 3 years into our marriage, I told my mother by text, 3 weeks after the birth, because I genuinely hadn't found the words to call and hadn't wanted to perform the joy of new motherhood for someone who I suspected would immediately ask, before congratulating me, who the father was and whether he had prospects. My mother called back furious that I'd waited so long to tell her, which struck me, even in the exhaustion of new motherhood, as almost darkly funny, given that she'd apparently never received the wedding invitation 3 years earlier that would have made the entire timeline make sense to begin with. I let her be angry. It was simpler than explaining. I told myself, in the specific self-justifying logic of someone protecting an old wound, that my children didn't need grandparents who would only ever ask them, eventually, when they were getting married, continuing the cycle 1 generation further. Inciting incident. The invitation to this particular Thanksgiving came from Chloe, not my mother, a group text sent 6 months after Chloe's own wedding, the one my mother had described to me in exhaustive, unsolicited detail across 3 separate phone calls I'd mostly let ring through to voicemail and listen to later, alone, feeling something complicated that wasn't quite jealousy and wasn't quite grief, but sat somewhere in the space between them. Mom wants everyone together. It's been too long. Please come. I miss you, Mari. I almost said no. Daniel found me sitting on the porch steps with my phone in my lap, staring at nothing, and when I explained, he sat down next to me and said something I've thought about often since. You're allowed to want a family, even after they've hurt you. Wanting doesn't mean you owe them access. It was the permission I think I'd needed, not to go, but to go without pretending it didn't cost me something either way. I said yes to Chloe. Some part of me, the part that at 32 still, quietly, wanted her mother to be proud of her, hoped that seeing Chloe settled into married life might soften something long calcified in my mother. I did not bring Daniel. I did not bring Rosa, then 3, or Mateo, then barely 1, still nursing through the night. I told myself it was because holiday travel with 2 small children was genuinely exhausting, which was true. The truer reason, underneath that true reason, was that I still hadn't decided whether I was ready to let my family exist in the same physical space as the people I loved most in the world. I did bring the folder. I'd found the delivery confirmation emails 18 months earlier while cleaning out an old university email account before it expired, and I'd sat with the printed receipts on my kitchen table for the better part of an evening, turning them over, deciding what, if anything, to do with them. I want to be honest. It wasn't purely innocent curiosity that made me print them and carry them in a folder for 1.5 years. Some part of me had been keeping them the way you keep a spare key, not planning to use it, but wanting to know exactly where it was, in case the day came when you needed to prove you'd once had a way in. Preparation. The week before Thanksgiving, I told Priya over coffee that I was thinking of bringing the folder. She was quiet for a long moment, stirring her latte long after the sugar had dissolved. What do you want out of it? She finally asked. Like, actually. Not the version where you get to watch her face fall. The real version. I didn't have a clean answer. I said something about wanting the joke to stop, about being tired of standing at the head of a table every year answering for a wedding that had already happened without them, about wanting my kids to eventually know why their grandmother had never visited. Priya nodded slowly. Just go in knowing it might not fix anything, she said. Sometimes the truth just makes a mess, and the mess doesn't clean itself up just because it's honest. I thought about that in the car on the 4-hour drive home for the holiday, Daniel beside me. The kids' car seats empty in the back this time, packed instead with a folder and an overnight bag. I thought about it again standing in my parents' driveway, my hand on the door handle, watching my breath fog in the November air before I finally went inside. Confrontation scene. After the folder hit the table, nobody moved for what felt like a full minute. The dining room, usually loud with the overlapping noise of Uncle Tom's football commentary and my aunt's gossip, had gone entirely, unnaturally still. My father picked up the top receipt first, holding it at arm's length the way he did with anything requiring reading glasses he refused to admit he needed. October 14th, he read aloud, slow and careful, like the words might rearrange themselves into something less damning if he looked hard enough. Signed for by D. Alvarez. He looked up, and something in his expression had shifted. Not anger yet, just a dawning, uncomfortable arithmetic. That's your mother's initial. Diane doesn't sign for packages, my mother said quickly. Too quickly, the words tumbling over each other. The mail carrier probably just wrote down whatever. You're the only D. Alvarez who lives at that address, Mom. Chloe's voice cut in, sharper than I'd ever heard it directed at our mother. She'd gone pale, reading over Dad's shoulder, her wine glass forgotten halfway to her mouth. I was still at my old apartment that year. It's not my signature. It's not mine to explain away. This is ridiculous, my mother said, but her hands had moved to the edge of the table, gripping the wood like she needed it to stay upright. I would remember an invitation to my own daughter's wedding, Marisol. I would remember that. Would you? I asked. I kept my voice even. The tone I'd spent a lifetime learning to hold steady in front of her, because raising it had only ever given her ammunition to call me dramatic, hysterical, ungrateful, whatever word best served the moment. Because I sent 3 invitations. 1 here, to you and Dad. 1 to Diego's old address. 1 to Chloe's apartment. I looked at my sister. Chloe's got sent to an address you'd already moved out of. That one, genuinely, I think just got lost in the shuffle, and Chloe, I've never blamed you for that. Her eyes had gone glassy. But yours came here, to this house, and it was signed for by someone with your initial, at an address only you and Dad have ever lived at. 3 years, my father said quietly, and something in his voice had shifted entirely, from disbelief into a kind of slow, tired grief that I hadn't expected and didn't quite know what to do with. 3 years you've been married, and we didn't know. We sat across from you at last Christmas and asked if you were seeing anyone, and you said you were focused on work. I have 2 children, I said, and the words landed harder in the room than the receipts had. Diego actually flinched. Rosa is 4. Mateo is 2. You have never met either of them. You didn't know they existed until 30 seconds ago. My mother made a sound I had genuinely never heard her make before. Not quite a sob, more like something structural giving way after years of quiet, unaddressed pressure. You have children? Her voice cracked on the word. Mari, you have, oh my God. Her hand went to her mouth. I told you about Rosa, I said. When she was born. You called me furious that I'd waited 3 weeks to mention it. I thought, she stopped, started again, her voice unsteady in a way I'd never heard from her. I didn't understand why you'd waited so long to even tell us you were seeing someone, let alone. I thought it was one of your work colleagues you'd casually mentioned. I didn't. Her hand pressed against her mouth harder. The invitation. Oh God, the invitation. Mom. Diego, who had sat entirely silent through all of this, finally spoke, and there was an edge in his voice I don't think I'd ever heard directed at our mother in 36 years of being her son. Did you throw away her wedding invitation? The silence that followed was different from the silence before it. It was the specific silence of someone standing at the edge of a truth they know they're about to have to say out loud, finally, after years spent building elaborate architecture to avoid it. I didn't want to go, my mother said, so quietly I almost didn't catch it over the sound of my own pulse. She was staring at her hands, not at any of us. I opened it and I saw the date, and I thought about sitting through a wedding where I didn't recognize the man standing next to my own daughter, where I'd spent her entire childhood imagining what her wedding day would look like. The church, the dress, all of it, and she'd built something completely different, on a cliff somewhere I'd never even heard of, without telling me a single detail about any of it. And I felt, her voice broke fully now, I felt like she'd already left long before that invitation arrived. Like the wedding was just paperwork for someone who'd stopped needing me years earlier. So I put it in the recycling, and I told myself it must not have mattered that much to her either. or she would have called to ask why we hadn't RSVP'd. She looked up at me then, and for the first time in my entire adult life, my mother looked genuinely, completely frightened, not of losing an argument, but of something much larger. I convinced myself you didn't actually want us there in the first place. It was easier to believe that than to sit with what I'd done. I wanted you there so badly, I paid extra for signature confirmation, I said, and my voice finally cracked. The first real crack in my own composure all night, the one I'd been holding back since I walked in the door 2 hours earlier. I stood on a cliff in a $40 dress with absolutely no one from my childhood watching, and I have spent 3 years telling myself it didn't matter, that I didn't need you there, and it has mattered every single day since. Every anniversary. Every time Rosa asks why grandma's never visited. Every single day. Nobody said anything for a long moment. My father reached across the table, not toward me, but toward my mother's hand, which was shaking visibly against the folder of receipts, the papers trembling slightly under her fingers. I didn't know, he said, to her, to me, to the whole silent table. I swear to God, I didn't know any of this. Immediate consequences. The rest of that dinner never fully resolved itself into a clean, orderly memory the way the beginning had. My mother cried, quietly at first, then not quietly at all, in a way I had genuinely never witnessed in 32 years of being her daughter. She asked to see photos, and my hands shook as I pulled them up on my phone. Rosa's gap-toothed 4-year-old grin, Mateo's second birthday with frosting smeared across his whole face, Daniel's arm around my waist on the bluff where we'd married, the sunrise turning the water gold behind us. She asked their names 3 separate times in the span of 10 minutes, as though repeating them might somehow make up for 4 years of not knowing them existed. Chloe cried too, hugging me longer and harder than she had in over a decade, apologizing for letting the family joke about my wedding continue as long as it had, admitting she'd always sensed something was being deliberately withheld from me, but had never pushed to understand why, hadn't wanted to disturb the fragile peace of family gatherings. Uncle Tom, of all people, was the one who finally broke the heaviest part of the silence, standing up to refill everyone's wine and saying gruffly, "Well, I think we should all eat something before it's completely cold, and then Mari can tell us everything we missed." It wasn't elegant, but it gave the room permission to breathe again, to move, to exist in something other than the weight of what had just been said. But something in me, even as I sat there being embraced by people, finally softened toward me in a way they'd never been before, could not fully unclench. I thought about every previous Thanksgiving where I'd sat through that same joke, smiling through it, because the alternative was making a scene at a table where scenes were never forgiven. I thought about the 4 years Rosa had existed in this world without a single grandmother who knew her name, her face, the sound of her laugh. I thought about calling my mother the night Mateo was born, letting it ring through to voicemail, and feeling something closer to relief than disappointment that I hadn't had to hear her voice in that raw, exhausted moment. Some part of that, the years, the specific absence, the version of my children's earliest life that will never include a grandmother's visit, a grandmother's hands holding them as newborns, is simply gone now. Nothing that happened at that table, no matter how honest, no matter how much crying, could retrieve any of it. My mother asked near the end of the night, her voice raw and stripped of its usual polish, whether she could meet the kids for Christmas. "I need to think about it," I told her. It was the first time in my life I'd said that sentence to her and genuinely meant it as a real boundary rather than a delay tactic dressed up as consideration. "You have to understand, I'm not trying to punish you. I just need to know this isn't a moment of guilt that fades once the holiday's over and everyone's gone back to their normal lives. I need to actually see it be real, over time, before I put my children in the middle of it." She nodded, and for the first time in as long as I could remember, she didn't argue with me, didn't try to reshape the moment into something more favorable to herself. Resolution/epilogue. We agreed to Christmas. Eventually, 6 weeks later, a small, deliberately tentative visit, for hours total, my mother sitting cross-legged on our living room floor letting Rosa braid ribbon into her hair while Mateo napped against Daniel's chest in the next room. My mother cried again when she met Daniel properly for the first time, apologizing to him directly, unprompted, for the version of herself that had made hiding him feel like the only safe option available to me. He was gracious about it, in the way he's gracious about nearly everything, though later that night, lying in bed, he admitted quietly that some part of him would probably always hold himself back from her a little, out of a kind of loyalty to all the years she hadn't been present for. I understood that completely. I felt the same quiet reservation myself, and I don't think it's ever fully gone away, even now. My mother and I talk more these days. Not weekly, nothing that intimate yet, but real conversations instead of the scripted performances we used to have for an audience of relatives. She's met the kids 5 times since that Christmas. Rosa calls her Grandma Diane now, which still catches strangely in my chest every time I hear it, a small warmth tangled up with an old grief I haven't fully named. My mother still, occasionally, says something that lands wrong, an old habit resurfacing under stress, a leftover reflex from 30 years of a particular way of loving that always came with conditions attached. I've learned to name it out loud when it happens now, instead of swallowing it the way I used to. She's gotten better at hearing it without getting defensive. Not perfect. Better. Diego and I are closer now than we've been since childhood, in a way I didn't expect from that one dinner. He calls sometimes just to talk, no occasion required, and once drove 2 hours to help Daniel fix a leaking roof without being asked. Chloe and I text most weeks. She named her own daughter, born last spring, with Marisol as a middle name, which she told me about shyly over the phone, like she wasn't sure I'd want that particular honor. I cried when she told me. I said yes, of course, immediately, before she'd even finished the question. But I think often about that folder, still sitting in the bottom drawer of my office desk at home, and what it cost to need it in the first place. 3 years of a marriage my mother missed entirely, a wedding day with an empty space in every photograph where her face should have been, for years of my daughter's early life spent as a complete stranger to half her family, for years of Sunday phone calls where I said nothing true because I'd learned, correctly, that the truth wasn't safe to offer. Some of that is simply permanently gone. It doesn't come back because the truth finally surfaced at a dinner table over cold turkey and cranberry sauce. My mother knows my children's names now, knows their faces, has held them both. She will never know what Rosa's first wobbling steps looked like, what Mateo's first word actually was, what it felt like to hold either of them in a hospital room in the minutes after they were born, exhausted and terrified and entirely alone in a way I've never fully told her about. Those moments happened. They happened without her. No number of Christmas visits, however warm, however genuine, will ever place her back inside them. I don't regret bringing the folder that night. I regret, more than almost anything else in my adult life, that it took a folder at all, that in my family the plain truth of a life fully and happily lived somewhere else required documentation, signatures, dated receipts, before anyone would believe it had really happened. I think about Rosa sometimes, old enough now to notice the framed photo from our cliffside wedding on the living room mantel, old enough to ask why Grandma isn't in any of the pictures. I tell her the truth, in small, careful pieces sized for a 5-year-old's understanding, that sometimes people we love make mistakes out of fear, and that fixing a mistake like that takes far longer than simply saying sorry once, out loud, at a dinner table. I still don't know, on certain quiet nights, whether 4 hours at Christmas and a handful of monthly phone calls are enough to call a wound like that fully closed. I suspect, honestly, that they aren't, that some part of that Thanksgiving dinner, the specific silence after the receipts hit the table, the particular sound of my mother's voice cracking on the words "you have children," will sit somewhere in my chest for the rest of my life. A reminder, permanent and unresolved, of exactly how much time, how many small, ordinary moments can be lost to a single folder that should never have needed to exist in the first place, and of how carefully, from now on, I intend to watch for the moments when I might be doing something similar to someone I love, without even realizing it.